Sounds good. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I am excited to be presenting today, talking to you about some of the work that I'm currently doing and will be doing in the coming years. Let's see, I'm going to try to weave the marine and coastal in as much as possible, as you'll see, since I think all of you are in this Center for Marine Science and Innovation. I guess maybe a Zoom hands up. How much economics does everybody have? Like if you've had some economic, okay, I see some little, I guess that question didn't really go, but laughing. I'm not sure if it's crying or laughing. Does that mean that you've had economics or you, I think those.
Self-taught.
Self-taught, right, okay, all right, some economics, okay. So, yeah, as with any research program, you can get really into it. And so if at any point you have a question or you want to stop me, please feel free, because this is a very active, it's kind of my first month of my summer, which is now for us. Today is literally my last day on duty for the academic year. I'm launching into this research program, and so I get pretty excited about it. So feel free to interrupt me. And just to, I'm going to be presenting some work from a team I have with a longstanding collaborator, another ecological economist, Regina Ostergaard-Clem, a feminist economist, Amanda Shaw, and then two research assistants, Amelia Van Saltza and Kate Crowell. And as I'll tell you, moving on, this project mainly is funded by our state statistical agencies, so the Division of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, which for an ecological economist is extremely exciting because usually we're marginalized outside of the statistical and the economic development agencies, and you're working for the environmental and less powerful state agencies. Yeah, so let's get started. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Beyond GDP movement. The idea here is that we want to replace the most influential indicator in the world, gross domestic product. We want to switch the indicators from this growth mindset that GDP underscores and kind of promotes to a well-being indicator. But we have to come up with an indicator that's as clear and appealing as GDP, but more inclusive of environmental and social aspects of progress. So this has been a research program that I've had since my days as a PhD student. And so it's been close to 20 years now that we've been working on better indicators, economic indicators that take environment seriously. And a lot of the beginning of this talk is inspired by this book, Replacing GDP by 2030, came out last year. It's a great and easy read if anyone wants to go more in depth. So a timeline of gross domestic product concept helps us understand that the economy is not actually a thing, it's a theory. In 1665, the UK decided that it needed to count up how big its economy was. And so it went out and it looked for whatever was productive. And it started counting the output of all of these productive sectors of the economy. And the graphic on the left is from my daughter's 3rd grade economics course. And I think it's awesome that she had this. And you had to figure out what of these things were a good and a service. And in the beginning of the national income accounts, nobody cared about services like health and firefighting and any of those things. All they cared about was goods produced, right? But then this famous guy, Adam Smith, so he was like, it's only goods. Then Alfred Marshall was like, oh, but we should expand it into services that fetch a price. It took 100 years after the UK did this first national income account, counting up all the goods and services in their economy, before other nations started counting up how big their economy was. Australia produced their first national income account in 1886. And then after that, for about 100 years, boom, exploded. Every nation started doing this national accounting, right? But what they counted in each one of their national accounts differed across nations. So how did GDP get so successful? How did it become this indicator that, you know, it's announced like every day on NPR, National Public Radio, they'll talk about what GDP did. Every quarter, businesses are waiting for this number to be emitted by the statistical agencies of nations. And actually in the 1920s in the US, the president didn't want any of this economic information. He was a very laissez-faire politician. It was a waste of time. There was no coherent, economic information when the crisis struck in 1929. And as a result of the kind of economic mismanagement, our president shifted from Hoover to Roosevelt, who was promising this Great New Deal, right? And pumping money into the economy. They commissioned Simon Kuznets, a young economist, to estimate for the US economic activity to help us get out of the Great Depression. And this was when all these official government statistical audiences started popping up, and economics as a field started gaining prominence. And probably many of you, if you've taken at least some economics or you've read some articles, have heard of Keynes's kind of Keynesian economics. And this was the period where this all started emerging. The next big event was World War II. The war effort required good economic planning to not disrupt the real economy. So they wanted to keep people working, but of course, so much of the economy had to be shifted to the war machine, and a lot of the labor force was going to leave and go to war. And so those national level accounting figures played a really big role in that planning effort. Okay, so then the next period, kind of after World War II, rebuilding of the world, Marshall Plan, et cetera, these big international agencies got set up, like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the OECD, and even the UN. And there was suddenly this social audience for economic information. They wanted economic statistics, and the government responded. The UN was set up as the coordinating, collecting, dissemination agency that also harmonized all the data across nations. So now we have this international statistical order, the framework. And we move straight into kind of the political season of the Cold War, where we had the communist versus the capitalist ideology. And economic growth became imperative. There was this like expand or die mentality. And surprisingly, I found it surprising that it was only in the 1950s that growth was the goal of economic policy, right? Prior to that, it was about, as I mentioned, unemployment or managing the war machine. But suddenly, GDP wasn't just a descriptive statistic, it was a policy imperative, it was a policy objective, like grow GDP. And it started getting put out in business magazines and newspapers, and people wanted to, like, just kind of Joe Schmo in the street was like, they knew GDP became the metric that was this abstract idea of an economy. It was GDP. And so kind of the economics field then really focused on determinants of economic growth. And this theory of kind of the macroeconomic theory of demand side economics was government pumping money into the economy. Nobody really bothered to worry about that or think about it too much. It was kind of the paradigm. In 1953, the first system of national accounts was published. So this is the UN put out these statistics for all the countries talking about unemployment and GDP and income, et cetera. It was all harmonized. And economists started infiltrating into government and think tanks and getting an even more prominent role in kind of setting policy. In the 1960s, there was kind of financial trouble in the US. We ran out of money because we poured it all into Vietnam. There was high inflation, stagflation, and that started to undermine the public's belief and politicians' belief in these macroeconomic gurus who said they could fix everything, right? And this is where this whole new school of economics comes in. It's called the neoclassical economics, Milton Friedman, and et cetera. And they were all about deregulating and privatizing. And this was politicized by politicians like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And so what happened was we saw this kind of dominant ideology of economics change, but GDP stayed as the goal of policy. The next, oh, whoops, there are friends. The next kind of era was the 90s into the aughts, where we had high growth and low inflation and less volatility. So everybody, started to be happy. But in the 1980s already, well, in the 1950s already, there was pushback to this growth mentality. In the 50s, there were worries about inequality in society, and already all the way at the beginning, when Simon Kuznets started to measure gross domestic product, he pointed out this is not a measure of welfare. This is a measure of something very specific, and it shouldn't be used as a measure of welfare. And then in the 60s, we got into these problems of modern society. People started pushing back on government. The 70s, we saw environmental issues and the birth of environmental economics. And then in the 1980s, this Our Common Future, the movement towards sustainable development, so kind of the three pillars of economic, social, and environmental development. So and then we're kind of in our where we are now, and we passed a 2008 financial crisis. It was the worst recession since the Great Depression, the mortgage market, the Lehman Brothers crash. And this was also a crisis in economic theory. Krugman put out this piece of how did economists get it so wrong? And we had kind of a return to demand stimulation, that Keynesian economics, away from the neoclassical supported austerity measures. And then all sorts of other things kind of came up about whether free trade is good. It boosts the economy a little, but it undermines democracy and causes all sorts of environmental problems. Okay, so this is the background. Like, GDP runs through all of this. It weathers every storm, and towards the last half of the century and into this century, we remain in this period of growth mentality. Sorry, I'm trying to get the slide here. So why did I just spiel on about GDP? Because GDP is incredibly misleading. So GDP is meant to measure the economy, but even this isn't clear. What is counted within GDP has varied over time, and a lot of things are not included in GDP that probably you and I care a lot about. So things like the care economy. So anything that isn't a market transaction gets ignored in GDP. GDP simply measures the value of those goods and services produced by an economy. But if that good or service doesn't have a market exchange, so things like grandparents taking care of children or children taking care of grandparents, any of that is not included. Inequality is also not included in GDP. issues of gender and race, health and quality of life, environmental depletion and degradation are actually positive. They contribute positively to GDP. And moreover, the future. GDP is about the here and now, and any damages that occur or costs that occur in the future are not deducted from the GDP metric. So it can be incredibly misleading as a policy metric. The nice thing about GDP is everybody now calculates it the same. It's reported in these system of national accounts. So year by year, you can say something about your the market of your market economy, and you can say, you know, how big the economy of Hawaii is compared to Australia, for instance. The other good thing about GDP is it is claimed that it is a good proxy for human well-being, right? And there are a lot of studies that show that relative well-being per capita charts with relative income per capita. But a growing body of literature disputes that relationship, that after a certain threshold, increases in income have not raised well-being for people. And then like green accounting, my field has shown that while GDP goes up, those green accounting aggregates actually fall due to environmental costs. So, you know, this idea that economic growth will lead to higher wages and lower inequality and lower environmental damage over time have unraveled. You know, all this to say that there's really no basis that GDP will be a good proxy in the future either for human well-being. Oops. Yeah, so the problem is that growth is built on the erosion of the asset base that we have at our disposal to generate well-being. And so this all leads to this beyond GDP movement that I want to talk to you about today. So this is kind of a collective movement to get cities, states, countries, the world to move beyond GDP as a policy metric and a policy goal, given how misleading it is, and to replace it with something more holistic. There are a lot of alternatives to the gross domestic product. We can supplement it with things like the Human Development Index or Sustainable Development Goals or natural capital accounting. We can replace it with, I'm sure many of you have heard of like the Gross National Happiness Index, or we can adjust GDP. So the green accounting with the genuine progress indicator or genuine savings. And today I'm only going to talk to you about two of these and activity here in the state of Hawaii to move these forward. Okay, so the first, the natural capital accounting. The idea here is that just like we account for the market economy, we would account for our environmental assets, right? So we consider all of nature's resources as assets, as economic assets, and we manage them just like we would manage a bank account. But the first thing we need to do in order to do that is to know what we have. And so over the last couple of decades, the same system of national accounts people at the UN have set up a system of environmental economic accounting. And so there's a few different methodologies out there, but the central framework focuses on these are the ones that have been around a little longer. They focus on accounting for land, water, minerals, timber, fish, soil, those sorts of assets. And then the experimental accounts, which are experimental because we don't yet have consensus on how to do ecosystem service modeling and valuation, are the ones that are under development now, and the ones that I am focusing on using here in Hawaii. So oceans, the idea here is that a lot of our economy centers around ocean activities, and that those are generally ignored in environmental statistics and economic statistics. And so there's been a big movement in the US and globally to develop the methods for capturing how important the ocean is to formal economic activity. So there was a blue paper emitted by a working group last year, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of the US government, Department of Commerce, has been focused on quantifying the economic value of different marine sectors. And that's all good. I think that's important. I'm glad people are focusing on quantifying how important the marine environment is to those goods and services that are captured under GDP. But that isn't really my love, my area of interest, my passion. I just, as Erin mentioned, I just was awarded a Pew Marine Fellowship to develop methods for coastal ecosystem services in Hawaii. So these are the non-market goods and services that our coral reef environments provide to us, and not just coral reef, but our tropical coastal environments. Some of those are relatively straightforward, fishing, right? Although small-scale fishing, as many of you probably know, was grossly underreported. And moreover, it's not just the amount of fish you catch, but it's the time you spent going out to fish, the time you spend with your family and friends, kind of that spiritual experience of going to the coast, being able to practice your cultural practices and pass those on to your kids, and to remember your connection to the environment, those reciprocal relationships that you have. Like, the methods that don't really exist to capture a lot of the benefits that we get from our coastal environments. And so some of the work over the next 3 years that I'm going to be doing is working with my students and working with groups here in Hawaii to try to find appropriate methods for some of the values that local communities and Native Hawaiians hold for the nearshore environment, in addition to some of the more readily modeled and valued services that the nearshore environment provide us. And all of this will feed back up into a national level working group on developing these ecosystem accounts for the nearshore. So that's one area of my research. The other area that I'm busy with this summer in particular is developing an alternative indicator for the state. So hopefully all of you, being ecologists and environmentally minded, understand that the economy is embedded within in the environment. Economists and classic economics models don't see it that way, but the ecological economics model is kind of embedded economy within the environment, where everything that we do relies on and affects the environment around us. And the genuine progress indicator is what I'm going to talk to you about, is a replacement for GDP. What does this thing look like? Well, what the genuine progress indicator is about 25 to 28, depending on which methodology, indicators that you combine in order to give you a better idea of the costs of economic activity. And those costs are both social and environmental. I'm gonna mute somebody because I keep getting feedback. Hold on one second. Oh, I can't mute you. Yeah, thanks. So it starts with the personal consumption. So, economists, kind of the economic model is that we generate our well-being through things we consume. And that doesn't mean just eat, but it's like, going out and hiking and, that the consumption is kind of a broad word for things you do. But then the things that we buy and the things that we do have impacts on society and environment, which need to be deducted, right? And so this GPI indicator has been estimated for over 20 countries and many states and territories. And so, the economic components, so you buy stuff, makes you happy, but then you pollute the environment, so that gets deducted. Some of the stuff you buy doesn't actually make you happy, like drugs, certain amount of alcohol, those sorts of things. And then the, kind of the macroeconomy can have impacts on society as well, like unemployment and homelessness and that crime and that sort of thing. And so those get deducted. So the idea for an indicator like this has a relatively long history in starting in 1972, kind of going back to that when I was talking about this discontent with GDP. Already folks in the late 60s were like, okay, we got to come up with something other than GDP. And then it evolved over time to until it turned into the GPI. But the GPI has been evolving since it was formed in 1999, as kind of I'll show you. But the first study of the GPI was concurrent for the US and in Australia. So the ANU has been really instrumental in developing the GPI over time. And Philip Lawn from Flinders University did an ex post kind of theoretical piece that's been really important in this indicator. So what this shows, these graphics show that global and the US and the UK, the blue is GDP in each one of these cases, and the orange is the genuine progress indicator. And so what's happening is that as the economy is growing, in each case, it's growing, at some point, either the social or the environmental ramifications of that economic growth are reducing the rate of growth of the GPI, right? So the economic growth is coming at a cost, right, in each one of these cases. A study done for Australia shows a very similar kind of trend. So, they're showing that the GDP was growing much higher, much faster than the adjusted, the genuine progress indicator. And here they divide out the economic, which you see growing, the social costs, which are or the benefits, or the actual social benefits, add to that economic growth, but the environmental costs increased over time. So the Australia's economic growth, particularly in the last couple of, or the first decade of this century, caused the GDP, the contrast with GDP, the growth came at a high environmental cost. Okay, I'm gonna skip that one. So just going to the states for a second, because Hawaii is a state, so we're following in the footsteps of an earlier study in Hawaii, but also a number of different states, and these flags are mapped onto the slide roughly according to how each state has done their GPI methodologically. So they've all followed kind of different paths. And the issue is that globally, there's no consensus on what the right method is and what should be included or not included, or whether it should be standardized or localized. So, there's a number of studies and that point out that we don't actually know, we're kind of schizophrenic about what the genuine progress indicator is actually measuring. There are a lot of interpretations, so that it's the welfare that a nation enjoys at a particular point in time, or it's the impacts of economic growth on sustainable welfare, or it is all about depreciation of community capital as an economic cost. And so this lack of clarity on kind of what the GPI is measuring it has caused some challenges conceptually and methodologically, which is what we're grappling with right now. Conceptually, we've got to have consensus on what it's trying to measure. Is it sustainable economic welfare, or is it kind of experiential social welfare at this moment, or is it just an ad hoc collection of meaningful indicators? Methodologically, this lack of standardization is impeding comparability between the states, but localization of the method, so for instance, in Hawaii, including indicators related to the marine and coastal environment, are much more policy relevant for us when we're trying to make localized decisions. Okay, one more little economic lesson. There are basically two notions of income. The first is psychic income, which has nothing to do with psychics, and I'm just kidding with the picture, but this is the idea that your income is reflected in kind of your sensations, your thought, your feelings. It's, remember that economics, like as you guys have learned it, this mathematical, et cetera, is a new thing, right? I mean, it really was only after the 1950s that math came into economics. Before that, it was much more of a philosophy, right? And so this really connected to humans. So your income has nothing to do with your money. It's about how good you feel, right? And things that make you feel good are positive income, and things that make you feel bad are negative to that. The other income kind of theory is about having enough, right? That the amount of income you have is whatever it is that you are using to derive welfare. You can't run out of it. And so your income is only as much as you can consume without in the future being worse off, right? And the reason people rely on that income is because if you're depleting your natural capital, that is a problem, right? We all know that's a problem. But your happy-go-lucky psychic income, you don't care. You'll care in the future when you don't have any of that natural capital, but you don't care now. All right, so all of this leads us to GPI 2.0. So this is this movement in beyond GDP. We need to harmonize. We need to bring everybody together. We need to create an indicator that can dethrone GDP. And we know we're going to need some rules, what we're going to include and what we can't include, and we're going to need to make some hard choices about. We all, as ecological economists, want to measure sustainability. We worry about the future, but are we able to do that and measure current welfare at the same time? That's kind of the state of the discussion right now. Okay, so skipping kind of to Hawaii and what we're doing here. as I said, we're super excited to be funded right now by DBED. And we had we've been having a number of discussions with kind of their economists in understanding what they want out of a new indicator. And drawing on Kate Rayworth's work of donut economics, like, we're worried about citizens of Hawaii thriving, right? So we're worried about current welfare. We're worried about distribution of that welfare amongst groups in society, including Native Hawaiian populations. And we're worried about the cultural dimensions of what makes Hawaii, Hawaii. We're worried about the economy, that it's at a sustainable scale, maintaining our capital stocks, including our coasts and our marine environment, and our environmental quality. We have a lot of issues with coastal pollution, plastic pollution, water pollution, et cetera, that we want to include. We want to be good global citizens, so we want to minimize transboundary externalities. So Hawaii is dependent on imports, as I was discussing with Erin in the beginning of this talk. We're dependent on tourism of people who all fly in and emit a lot of carbon. And we want to be good ancestors. So we want to consider intergenerational externalities of the Hawaiian economy. But we also don't want to localize our indicator too much to not be able to compare how Hawaii is doing to other states or provinces globally, right? So that's one of the big powers of GDP, as I mentioned, is that it's comparable across all contexts. So the work that we're doing in Hawaii builds on well, 7 years ago or so, another study that we did introducing the GPI to Hawaii through another state agency, the Department of Health, where we piloted a GPI, and we realized that the GPI at that time that the GPI was good, but inadequate. Economically, it doesn't capture this inequality across groups in society, and we have real problems with marginalized communities of color. So that's something that it doesn't include. It also doesn't capture the reciprocity economy, and that term, I mean that a lot of things happen in Hawaii without money changing hands. So care economy, you take care of your neighbor, you take care of your family, multi-generational households, et cetera. On the environment, none of the other state GPIs have anything with marine and coasts, right? So, destruction of coral reefs or quality issues in the coastal environment are not included, nor are invasive species. So, ballast water, anything like that, or terrestrial invasive species for that matter. Terrestrially, we're a biodiversity hotspot globally, but we're also the invasive species capital of the world. So that's sad. Social capital and GPI is relatively weak on kind of all of these networks that we know are important for resilience to disasters. For instance, resilience, social capital is important for community management of resources. And then we have this issue of brain drain, that people leave the islands because they can't get jobs here. And I already mentioned the importance of cultural practices. There's a real renaissance of Hawaiian culture, language, and power happening in the islands right now. And the importance of preserving language and cultural practices is paramount. So what's our path forward here in Hawaii? Well, the state really wants this comparable indicator across states. So we're going to propose a set of indicators that harmonizes the latest scholarship and innovates a bit. We're going to ensure that we also add on some indicators of local concern. We're going to develop indicators for the coasts. ecosystem service modeling from the coral reef and beaches and nearshore environment. And then, there's this tension in those two income categories, right? The kind of that psychic income is all about the here and now. How are our citizens doing? We look only at the local scale natural capital, only at kind of what's within Hawaii's borders. Like how are we, is that being depleted? Are we polluting is our economic activity within Hawaii polluting our environment? And so we're going to report that, but we're also going to report out, we're going to say, okay, but in order to answer those questions of are we at a sustainable scale, are we good global citizens, and are we good ancestors, we need to look outside of our borders. We need to understand what the impacts of Hawaii's economy are, including the tourism economy, on the rest of the world. And so to do that, we're developing methods of what's going to be included. What we've been doing in the last week is reviewing kind of for each one of these indicators, whether methods exist, whether data exists, where we are as a research endeavor, in order to, by the fall, bring a new indicator to our state agencies. Yeah, so we have a lot of work, especially since none of the other states have incorporated the marine and coasts. So a lot of our work, and particularly with the Pew funded work, will be to develop the models and valuations needed to really get the non-market coastal resources a seat at the table, and to have that be part of what's considered when we transition, hopefully, from a growth mindset into a more holistic policy environment. Okay, so some final thoughts here. First thing is we've got to end our addiction to GDP and growth. And I think one thing that needs to happen is to replace GDP as an indicator of economic welfare. And so, we have to stop worshiping it and move on to something else. As one of the technicians involved, we need to set a standard, even though it might be imperfect, and just live with it, and recognize that an index like GPI can't be all things to all people. Part of the problem is that everybody keeps pushing on it to be more and more and more and more. But just as we did with GDP, we were like, stop. We know it's not great. It doesn't do everything really well, but it does something well, and just continue on. And then we need to be advocates for change. Work with the government statistical agencies, even if it takes a decade to get their attention, right? It took, between that first Hawaii study and now, it's almost 10 years. And we've been patient, and we've been, out there talking with them, and we finally have a policy window, which is really exciting. And then, GPI isn't everything, and there, so it has to be connected to other metrics of progress, of which there are quite a few, and even just in Hawaii, we've got some really amazing groups that collect information from the ground up, like from communities, for instance, ask them what they care about and measure those things over time. And so from the top down, you got GPI, and from the bottom up, and between all of that, we can start tracking well-being and how it's connected to nature. Okay, that's what I've got for you. Thank you so much. I would be happy to take any questions or discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kirsten. We'll turn it over to the largely videoless crowd at the moment for any questions you might have. Economics, ecological. Jordan, give a shot.
Sure. Is it working? Oh, wait. There we go.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kirsten, for the talk. So in terms of the indicators, how are they generated? Are they from, I saw there's a lot of different types of information, and would those be contained within some kind of national accounting structure? And given that you use indicators to compare between different administrative areas, for example, is that the role of this specific one? Like, could you compare Hawaii versus California, for example?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So that's why we're gonna what we want is we want a standard set, a standard set of indicators that everyone does, and everyone does it the same, right? So it's like the personal consumption and how you value unpaid work, and how you deduct for natural capital depletion, right? The kind of set some of those big ticket items, right? And be like, okay, the GPI are just these things, and these are the data sets for them, right? And these are the methods for quantifying change and putting a value on them, right? And everybody does them the same way. And then you'd have comparability between any GPI study, no matter what scale, right? And then you could have add-on accounts that are local, right? So, for instance, in Hawaii, we may have something that counts for coral reef loss, right? So as we lose area of coral reef, and put a value on that, and so then every state or policy agency could come up with that localized set of indicators, and be transparent about what those are, and so almost report out two different things, right? But the idea is that these all the indicators as well as the aggregate would be reported by the state statistical agency alongside all the other SNA, System of National Accounts, indicators.
I guess, so just a thing, I'm from the Global Ocean Accounts Partnership here at UNSW.
Oh yeah, of course.
So our main concern is, how do you ensure that people measure or at least account for things in the same way? So unless you have some sort of defined environmental economic account, you could be picking and choosing how you record the deterioration of a specific ecosystem.
Yeah, and especially for those ecosystem accounts, right? It's really still, I think, early in the process, right? It's very hard, and that kind of negotiation process that GDP went and the System of National Accounts went through is going to have to happen for ocean systems too, right? And all ecosystems.
Thanks.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for you. It is difficult. I don't think there's like a magic bullet here. Okay, John has his hand up. Yeah.
Mannerly, raising your hand.
Yeah, great talk. Thanks, Kirsten, and very timely for me. One thing I'm interested in is whether or not there's any diagnostic capability built into frameworks like this through cause and effect linkages. So, for example, well-being might go down, but it might be driven by environmental factors or other factors, and whether or not there's the capability of sort of looking at, well, why is this happening, as opposed to just measuring, say, 15 things and then adding them together.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And no, I mean, honest answer is no. I mean, there are, it's not like a systems model, right, where you have causal relationships built in. I think there's been a lot of thought and wisdom that about which indicators are in and which are out, right? But those that's part of the issue we have, is that like which indicators should be included and which shouldn't in a standard framework, because what matters in one place may not matter in another, right, as much. But so I mean, so that I think the choice of those indicators is based on some understanding of cause and effect, right? But it's not a predictive model. You can't, other than looking at those trends over time, you can't use it to then say, oh, well, if we, the economy does this, then environment will do that, or it was this aspect of the economy that caused this degradation of the environment.
Yeah, okay. I mean, to me, the value of those linkages is not so much even diagnostic, it's just understanding that we need to look after X in order to achieve Y. And if we're just measuring X and Y without an understanding of that relationship, then we don't have the managerial actions flowing from the framework. So, okay, well, that's interesting. So at the moment, there's no sort of attempt to do that, but maybe something to look at in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like in each individual case, you can dig into that, right? So it as an indicator doesn't provide you with that, but you would, just as you interpret any data, you can then go in and look for those causal mechanisms within the context, right?
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sure.
Alex?
Thanks for a great talk. I've just started reading this donut economics book. I haven't got very far yet, but I found it fascinating. I wanted to ask, sort of there's various value judgments that are going to go into weighting the indicators to make this index. And just how can you get agreement from different countries and different states on how you would weight these things, particularly when you've got, one leader doesn't believe in climate change, or that leader changes over time, and you go from one that believes to one that doesn't, the one that does, and how does this work?
Yeah. So first, a funny anecdote: the Utah study that was done was under a Republican administration, and they had to change the label of the indicator from climate change to something else. Like they changed it to like impact water resource, because water resources is the main impact in the dry state. So they did something about like water resource depletion or something like that. So it can get very political. But this isn't an index in the sense of other indices where you kind of mush everything together, like the Human Development Indicator and things like that, right? Each one of the components has to be monetized. So its weight is reflective of its contribution or cost to human well-being. So for instance, you lose wetlands, and each wetland is valued at X dollars per hectare in terms of the ecosystem services it provides. So you subtract out the hectares times value per hectare each year of the wetlands you lose. Similarly, air pollution has human health impacts, and those human health impacts can be monetized. And the social costs, so like lost leisure time, you value leisure time at a certain percentage of average wage rate, right? So each one of them has been, is linked to kind of economic theory of the utility. It's the utility function. So it's each thing is weighted by the amount of utility or disutility that it provides to people.
But in that it's very difficult from one country to the effect in a developed country.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there, like with and with evaluation, the resources, et cetera, right? But you know, in the climate change, so there are two components of climate change. One is the climate change damages to you, you know, and your people and your assets, right? And so accounting for costs of sea level rise and costs of agricultural loss and things like that. You know, if you can get the methods down, people can estimate those damages, right? And then there's the kind of the social cost of carbon question of, like, you emit carbon, you're responsible for those damages, no matter where they or when they occur, right? And so, you know, that's whatever your carbon equivalent emissions are times some social cost of carbon that is agreed upon by the statistical methodology. So I mean, that gets back to the importance of, like, establishing the methodology and just being like, it can't be it's not going to be perfect, but it shouldn't matter whether you're developed or developing or what the politics are. It's just like, this is how what we count, how we count it, and how we value it.
Thanks.
And Jordan, you have a
quick question
to close us out.
Yep, sure. Yeah, so we just had a workshop a few days ago on trying to embed Indigenous values into the framework, and it is quite difficult because, and correct me if I'm wrong, both of our frameworks are quite neoliberal in a sense. And we try and evaluate things or measure things, and there are things that we could probably agree on that shouldn't be valued. And also many things that can't be measured in physical or monetary terms. So in terms of getting their perspective or using their lens within your indicator, how would that be accomplished, if at all possible?
Yeah, that's a big question. Yeah, I mean, I feel I feel of a number of different minds. I think the efforts to expand the types of values that we hold for the environment is, you know, we've gotten amazingly far in the last couple of decades, just getting the environment you know, onto so we're still way far behind in thinking about how to embed Indigenous values, as you said. And you know, I think I have a Native Hawaiian student working on valuation of cultural ecosystem services, and you know, the one line is just, don't, you know, they're just different worldviews, right? The neoclassical or the you know, the economic worldview doesn't have room for the Indigenous worldview. I'm more hopeful. I think that maybe one day we'll have a kind of a poly worldview in our policy arena, but right now we're stuck with what we've got. So we just got to keep pushing those methods forward to get at least something on the table. But yeah, there are people working on that are a lot more able to talk on that point than I. But you know, maybe it's that we add constraints in, right, where we say no more than X, and like, I mean, this also doesn't deal with environmental thresholds. So maybe there are also other sorts of ideas of, you know, that we need to continue the development Again, no
Thanks.
easy
Yeah,
answer.
there's no right answer to
Great
this.
questions. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, it starts to go back to those kind of philosophical roots to economics, but we'll let you off the hook with all the hard questions. And just everyone join me once again in thanking Kirsten for coming in, delivering a really thorough and insightful talk, and hopefully we can think about these things a little bit more in all of our research here at UNSW. If you ever get to come visit your brother.
Well, cool. Good luck, everybody.
To say hi.
Yeah, I will. I will.
See how much
I'll
progress
let you know.
we've made by then.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks so
All
much.
right. Thank you, guys. Thanks for inviting me.
Our pleasure. Bye.
Bye.